My name is Evelyn Sterling, and at 58 years old I have learned one absolute truth about power. The most dangerous woman in any room is never the one raising her voice, demanding attention, or wearing her wealth like a heavy, suffocating perfume. The most dangerous woman is the one sitting quietly in the corner, knitting a sweater, while holding the master keys to the entire building. My only son Julian was getting married to a woman who saw as nothing more than a stain on her perfect aesthetic. I was perfectly content to stay in the background to let her have her shining moment, until I overheard her giving strict instructions to her elite wedding planner. Put his mother by the trash at the back, she is a peasant, she is not really part of this family, and I will not have her ruin my photos. I did not scream, I did not shed a single tear, I simply picked up my worn leather handbag, smiled at the brass plaque on the wall, and made one 30-second phone call. By the following Monday, her exclusive $50 million dream venue was gone. For weeks they blamed the management, the weather, and a random catastrophic scheduling glitch. They never once thought to ask whose name was actually engraved on that brass plaque. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories, where the women who are dismissed, ignored, and pushed to the shadows turn out to be the ones who hold the world in their hands. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and if you have ever been made to feel invisible by the very people you sacrificed everything for, hit that subscribe button. This story phone rang on a brisk Tuesday afternoon. It was Julian, my son, and he was speaking with that rapid, breathless cadence he only uses when he is trying very hard to conceal his anxiety. "Mom, I asked Clara to marry me," he announced. "She said yes." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, letting the cool granite steady me. "Julian," I said, my voice warm and steady, "that is wonderful news. And God help me, I meant it. I had spent so many years waiting for him to find a happiness that grounded him, a love that made him feel secure." He launched into a dizzying monologue about dates, seasons, and potential venues. I listened with a soft smile, nodding along even though he could not see me. Beside the door, resting inside my handbag, a heavy ring of brass keys shifted slightly, letting out a faint melodic jingle. Over the past 3 decades I had built something monumental in the shadows. Something Julian never bothered to ask about because he simply assumed my life began and ended with baking and gardening. I let him believe that the empire I had built had a name, it had a sprawling staff, and very soon, my son was going to walk through its gilded front doors without ever realizing he was standing inside my house. The wedding became Clara's absolute obsession within less than a week. That was fine. I firmly believe a bride should have her day, and I had no intention of stepping on her toes. But I noticed the pattern incredibly fast. I was never asked for my opinion. I was only informed of decisions that had already been firmly locked into place. Julian would call with updates that were essentially edicts. The florist had been selected, the colors were a precise shade of midnight blue and champagne, and the date was set for late October. When I gently offered to help, to perhaps look at some flower arrangements or help with the guest list, he had a perfectly rehearsed, gentle answer ready every single time. "Clara's got it entirely handled, Mom," he would say, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and dismissal. "Don't worry your head about a thing." I told myself that this was simply love. It was a young man proud of his capable fiancée, stepping back to let her shine in her element. I did not need to run the wedding, I did not want to control the flowers or the menu. I just wanted a chair at the table, I just wanted to be a mother watching her son get married. Then he told me the name of the venue they had miraculously secured. "We booked the Monarch Estate," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave with reverence. "It is the most exclusive property in the entire state. Clara is absolutely beside herself, she cannot believe we got a date." I set my tea down on the counter very carefully. The porcelain cup did not make a single sound against the granite. "The Monarch Estate," I repeated, letting the syllables roll over my tongue. "Are you familiar with it?" "I have heard the name," I said. That was true in a very specific, deliberate manner of speaking. He kept talking, rattling off details about the crystal chandeliers and the sweeping marble staircases, but I had completely stopped hearing him. My mind had traveled back 38 years. It went back to a time of shattered glass, rotting floorboards, and a roof that let the rain pour straight into what used to be a grand ballroom. "Mom, are you still there?" Julian asked, breaking through my reverie. "I am here," I said, my voice perfectly level. "It sounds incredibly beautiful, sweetheart." He had no idea why that specific name, my hands go perfectly still. Neither did Clara. I was not ready to tell them. Not yet. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my kitchen for a very long time. holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, bearing the weight of a secret that was starting to feel heavy and electric. I met Clara properly the following Sunday. Julian brought her, along with her mother, Victoria, to my house for a supposed get-to-know-you lunch. Clara was lovely to look at in a very sharp, polished and expensive way. She wore a tailored beige trench coat and carried a designer bag that cost more than my first car. Her eyes performed a swift, surgical sweep of my home the moment she stepped over the threshold. She took in my worn cardigan, the slightly frayed edges of the living room rug, my modest furniture, and the ancient station wagon resting in the driveway. I watched her internally file me away into a very specific category: harmless, poor, old, and irrelevant. Her mother, Victoria, entered the room behind her with the posture of a monarch gracing a peasant village with her presence. Victoria wore heavy, authentic pearls to a casual Sunday lunch. She managed to casually mention the Kensington family legacy 3 times before I had even served the soup. "We are an incredibly old family," Victoria announced, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "Our roots in this state go back several generations. The Kensingtons have always maintained a certain standard." "How wonderful for you," I said, my voice pleasant and entirely devoid of meaning. Victoria then asked what I used to do for a living, adopting that specific tone people use when they ask a question they believe they have already answered in their own minds. "I was in hospitality," I said simply. "Oh," Victoria offered a small, deeply patronizing nod. "Housekeeping is very honest work, Evelyn. My grandmother always said that there is dignity in scrubbing floors." I let the comment sit in the air. I did not correct her. I have found over the years that silence costs absolutely nothing. Yet it reveals everything about the person desperately trying to fill it. Clara and Victoria traded a swift, knowing look that I was not meant to catch, but I caught it anyway. Then Clara offered a dazzling, entirely hollow smile and immediately changed the subject to the seating chart. "We want the reception to be extremely elegant," Clara explained, waving her hand dismissively. "We want everyone perfectly placed to ensure the right aesthetic flow." Victoria reached out and patted her daughter's hand affectionately. "The real family always sits up front, darling," Victoria declared. "That is simply how things are done in our circles." The words landed lightly like a stray feather. Victoria meant them as an indisputable rule, a law of the universe that she expected everyone, especially me, to blindly obey. I filed that statement away in the exact same manner they had filed me. I smiled warmly, stood up to fill their water glasses, and remarked on how perfectly the lunch had turned out. The next 3 weeks served as a masterclass in learning exactly where I stood in their new hierarchy. The exclusive bridal dress fitting came and went. I only heard about it casually days later. The extravagant florist appointment, the private cake tasting, the custom menu selection, every single door was firmly shut in my face before I even knew they had been opened. Clara would occasionally send a brief, patronizing text message punctuated with a generic pink heart emoji. "We have everything completely covered, Evelyn. Save your energy, save my energy." She spoke to me as if I were a fragile piece of spun glass that might shatter if exposed to a mild breeze. Victoria called me once to reiterate the seating arrangements. She referred to the back table as the comfortable table twice, clearly incredibly pleased with her own clever phrasing. "You will be so much more comfortable back there, dear," Victoria purred through the phone, away from all the noise and the chaos of the young people. Then the formal, gold-embossed printed invitations finally arrived in the mail. I held the incredibly thick, expensive cardstock under the harsh light of my kitchen. I read the elegant calligraphy: "Mother of the groom, Eveline Sterling," not even Evelyn. They had misspelled my given name on my own son's wedding invitation. I set the heavy card down on the counter and stared at it for a very long time. Eveline, a phantom, a woman who did not actually exist. I almost laughed. I came terrifyingly close to laughing out loud in the empty kitchen. There is a very specific type of profound insult that is so complete, so utterly blinding, that it actually loops all the way back around to being genuinely hilarious. But I did not laugh. I simply folded the expensive invitation perfectly in half and set it aside. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Arthur's younger sister, Margaret. She was the one genuinely good apple in a barrel of rot. "Evelyn, I just saw the preliminary seating chart Clara posted online. This is absolutely abhorrent. I am so incredibly sorry." I read the message twice. Margaret saw it. Margaret, a woman who possessed absolutely no wealth and no power to change it, saw the blatant disrespect clear as day. My own son either completely blinded himself to it, or worse, actively chose not to see it. I typed back 2 simple words: "I am fine." Then I put the kettle on the stove and began the quiet meticulous process of making up my mind. I needed to be absolutely certain before I pulled the trigger. I invited Julian to lunch the next day, just the two of us. I chose the small rundown diner we used to frequent when he was a little boy, hoping the nostalgia might break through whatever spell Clara had cast over him. I tried to approach the subject with as much maternal gentleness as I could muster. "Julian, sweetheart," I started, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. "I am feeling a little pushed out of the wedding preparations." Julian furiously stirred his black coffee, refusing to meet my eyes. "Mom, please, come on, you hate big, fancy, pretentious things, you always have, do I?" I asked softly. "You used to complain through every single ritzy school function I had," he said, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile, desperately trying to keep the conversation light. "Clara is just streamlining everything, she is just keeping it simple for you, simple." There was that deeply condescending word again, dressed up in a nice suit. Then he said the one thing that revealed the exact rot at the core of his silence. "Do you remember the kids at Oak Ridge Academy?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do you remember how they used to call you the motel lady because you worked in hospitality? I hated that. I hated them for it. I want this wedding to be completely smooth. I don't want anyone looking down on us." And there it was, the absolute undeniable truth. My brilliant, successful 34-year-old son was still violently flinching at a derogatory nickname some spoiled, rich children had thrown at me over 2 decades ago. He had spent his entire adult life running at breakneck speed, trying to outrun where he came from. And somewhere along that exhausting marathon, he had started to genuinely believe that where he came from, that I was something deeply shameful that needed to be hidden away. That realization hurt infinitely worse than being seated by the trash cans. "Julian," I said, my voice remaining perfectly even, completely devoid of the heartbreak I felt. "I do not hate fancy things. What I hate is being told that I am not allowed to be near them." He finally looked away, staring out the greasy diner window at the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, looking at anything and everything except my face. That silence was my absolute answer. I calmly paid for both of our coffees exactly the way I had paid for everything his entire life, and I drove home. I drove home knowing exactly what kind of fight I was going to wage. It would not be a fight of words, it would be a fight of utter annihilation. Victoria invited me for coffee that Friday at an absurdly pretentious cafe downtown. I genuinely think she believed she was doing me a massive favor, throwing a bone to a starving dog. We sat at a tiny marble table with far too much brass detailing and nowhere near enough natural light. She confidently ordered for both of us without once asking what I actually wanted. "I wanted to give you some mother-to-mother guidance, Evelyn," Victoria said, leaning in conspiratorially. "How incredibly kind of you," I replied, my face a mask of polite interest. The foundation of my silence was built on decades of relentless, grueling work. I did not inherit a vast fortune. I built a massive empire out of sheer unadulterated grit and an absolute refusal to be defeated. When Arthur and I first bought the Monarch estate 38 years ago, it was nothing more than a condemned, rotting carcass of a building. The entire town council had voted unanimously to demolish it. We bought the ruin for pennies, securing a high-risk loan that I absolutely should not have qualified for, driven by a stubbornness I had inherited directly from a mother who spent her life scrubbing other people's floors until her hands bled. We rebuilt that massive estate literally room by room, stone by stone. Arthur worked on it every single weekend and I worked on it every single day, 12 hours a day, covered in plaster dust and exhausted beyond measure. Clara called it the venue, Victoria called it a place run like a motel, I called it the very first thing I ever physically pulled out of absolute ruin. Myself included, over the next 3 decades I didn't just stop at the Monarch. I quietly acquired failing luxury properties, injected them with ruthless efficiency and flawless design, and turned them into highly profitable, world-class destinations. I built Sterling Vanguard from the ground up entirely in the shadows. I employed over 3,000 people globally. I sat on the boards of 4 major philanthropic foundations. And I did it all while wearing my faded cardigans and driving my ancient station wagon, because true power does not need to scream for validation. True power simply exists, massive and immovable. On Monday morning, precisely at 8 o'clock, Marcus called my private line. He calls on the first Monday of every single month to deliver the comprehensive property numbers. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional. "Overall occupancy across the portfolio is incredibly strong. The Monarch is operating at near maximum capacity. October is fully booked." We systematically went through the spreadsheets the exact way we always do. Bookings, major repairs, the new high-efficiency HVAC system being installed in the West Wing. Then he paused. It was a deliberate, heavy pause. There's one specific booking on the books that I felt I needed to personally flag for your attention, Marcus said carefully. The Kensington Sterling wedding, scheduled for October 18th. That is your son's event, is it not, ma'am? I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. Yes, Marcus, it is. I assumed as much, he replied, his tone remaining perfectly neutral. The initial deposit came in under the bride's name entirely. I did not want to make any assumptions regarding your involvement. For 22 years that man has called me ma'am, owner, and Mrs. Sterling. He has signed his name directly beneath mine on every major financial report. He has never, not once, called me Eveline. My son had chosen to host his lavish wedding inside my house. He had walked its grand halls, openly admired its hand-painted ceilings, booked its most expensive ballroom, and never once paused to wonder who actually owned the place where his mother used to do hospitality. And his bride, the woman who demanded to be treated like royalty, had ordered me to sit at table 12, hidden by the swinging kitchen doors. Marcus, I said, my voice barely a whisper, do not execute any actions just yet, I will be in touch shortly. Of course, ma'am. I hung up the phone and sat perfectly still, letting the sheer audacity of the situation wash over me. She had meticulously planned her absolute perfect day right down to the humiliating back table, inside a house that legally bore my name. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the house, I walked back into Arthur's study. I finally opened the locked cedar box. The wood still held its strong, earthy scent after all these years. I lifted the heavy lid. Resting on the very top was a photograph, its edges yellowed with age, dated June 1989 in Arthur's familiar, blocky handwriting. I am in the photograph. I am 34 years old, my hair tied back in a messy bandana, standing dead center in the middle of a catastrophic wreck. Behind me you can clearly see the skeletal remains of the monarch estate. Half the slate roof is missing, the windows are shattered like broken teeth, and thick weeds are pushing up through what was left of the grand ballroom floor. I am holding a heavy metal bucket and grinning like an absolute fool. I carefully turned the photograph over. Arthur had written 4 simple words on the back. The day we won. Beneath that photograph was the original certified deed. My name was printed on it, plain as day, Eveline Sterling, sole legal owner, officially recorded at the county clerk's office, summer of 1989. And resting directly beneath the deed was a formal letter. Cream-colored, heavy stock paper, formal, elegant type. It was from the State Historical Preservation Society, explicitly thanking me by name for saving a vital landmark that the town had wanted to destroy. I sat on the worn rug of my late husband's study and held 38 years of blood, sweat and triumph in my lap. I placed everything back into the cedar box, but this time I deliberately left the lid open. For 2 full days I did nothing. I simply sat in my quiet house, drinking tea, and thought deeply about what I possessed and exactly what I wanted to do with it. I want to be brutally honest here. I did not initially want revenge. Revenge is a loud, cheap, messy emotion, and it rarely ever sits right in the stomach afterward. What I wanted was far simpler and infinitely more dangerous. I wanted to permanently stop pretending that I was small. For 18 agonizing months following Arthur's death, I had allowed everyone around me to decide that I was nothing more than a tired, irrelevant widow in a worn cardigan. I had allowed Clara to banish me to the back of the room. I had allowed Victoria to condescendingly teach me my proper place in society. I had allowed my own son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, to look away in a greasy diner because he was ashamed of my existence. Clara had explicitly stated that I was not really part of this family. Fine, I accepted her terms. She was the bride. It was her absolute right to draw her circle wherever she saw fit, and to exclude anyone she deemed unworthy. But the house was not hers. The house, the estate, the entire empire was mine. If I was not a part of their family, then their family had absolutely no claim to the one magnificent thing I had built with my own 2 hands. Then I will make sure I am not, I said again aloud, standing alone in the quiet study. The words carried a vastly different weight now. Now they had the undeniable backing of a multi-million-dollar deed. And for 34 years I carried my son. I paid the exorbitant tuition for the elite academy where the rich children called me the motel lady. I paid for his Ivy League college, his first luxury apartment in the city, his first car. He never knew even half of it. I meticulously made sure of that. That is the tragic flaw of quiet carrying. The person you are carrying eventually forgets that there is any weight at all. They begin to believe they are flying entirely on their own. So, I was not going to punish anyone. Punishment is a tool for people who still desperately want to feel something, who want to extract an emotional reaction. I was completely past wanting to feel things. I was only going to set down the massive weight I had been holding for decades. I was going to step back and let them feel the actual crushing size of it. I will not punish them, I whispered to the empty shadowed kitchen. I will simply stop carrying what they refuse to acknowledge I carry. The refund would be absolute. Every single cent of the $10,000 would be wired directly back into Clara's bank account. I would take nothing from them. I would only take back the solid ground beneath their feet. Tomorrow was Saturday. There was a final mandatory seating walkthrough planned at the hall. It was Clara's idea, naturally an opportunity to gloat over her perfect domain. I was expected to be there, and I knew exactly what I was going to say, and more importantly, exactly what I was not going to say. Saturday morning dawned bright, crisp, and brutally cold. The final walkthrough was a masterclass in performative exclusion. Clara marched through the grand ballroom wielding a thick clipboard, with the exhausted wedding planner hovering anxiously at her elbow. Julian trailed several paces behind them, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking everywhere but at me. Victoria was present, of course, wearing her signature pearls and an expression of smug satisfaction. Clara briskly walked me over to a massive ornate seating chart that had been pinned to a gilded easel near the main entrance doors. "So I just wanted to make sure you can see exactly where everyone is placed," Clara said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She pointed a perfectly manicured acrylic nail to a tiny isolated square located in the extreme far corner of the diagram. Table 12. It was practically tucked behind a massive pillar, pressed tight against the back wall, situated uncomfortably close to a door clearly marked restrooms and the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. "That is you," Clara announced, smiling broadly. "It is incredibly cozy back here, Evelyn." "Nice, secluded, and very quiet." "Cozy," I repeated, my voice flat. "Yes. You will have Arthur's older cousins for company," Clara explained, waving her hand. "The elderly crowd. We figured you would all prefer to be away from the loud music." Victoria nodded vigorously in agreement. "It is significantly more comfortable, Evelyn. Trust me." The wedding planner shifted her weight uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the floor, clearly mortified by the blatant disrespect. Then Clara turned to the young planner and said it again. She said it out loud in front of everyone, making absolute certain I heard it. "Just make absolutely sure you keep the groom's mother secured at table 12, Clara instructed firmly. "She is not really part of this side of the family. The aesthetic will flow much better this way." The planner's pen hovered nervously over the clipboard. She shot a desperate, pleading glance at me, and then a harsh look at Julian. Julian aggressively studied the intricate pattern of the marble floor. There it was, the final unforgivable line had been stepped over in broad daylight, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, with my own son standing less than 3 feet away, saying absolutely nothing to defend me. I smiled. I possess a truly terrifying smile when the situation calls for it. It reaches my eyes but carries absolutely no warmth. "It is a lovely arrangement," I told the terrified planner, my voice smooth as silk. "Thank you so much for all of your incredibly hard work." Then, without another word, I picked up my worn leather handbag, turned my back on all of them, and walked slowly and deliberately toward the grand foyer. The heavy brass keys shifted inside my bag. They made their small, familiar metallic sound. This time I was fully prepared to use them. I walked into the sweeping foyer and stopped directly at the east wall. I stopped right in front of the polished brass plaque. Let me tell you exactly what it says. "The Monarch Estate, rescued from ruin and fully restored in 1989 through the unwavering vision, relentless grit and soldierosity of Evelyn Sterling." My name, etched deep in solid brass, meticulously polished by Marcus' staff every single Sunday for 22 years. Hanging a mere 6 feet from the main doors, my future daughter-in-law had strutted through to plan her perfect, aesthetic day. She had walked past it a dozen times, so had Victoria, so had my son. Not a single one of them had ever bothered to look up. I stood there in my faded, worn cardigan, standing squarely in front of my own legacy, and I calmly took my phone out of my bag. I scrolled directly to Marcus. He answered on the very first ring, anticipating the call. "Mrs. Sterling," he said. "Marcus," I replied, my voice calmer than a frozen lake. "The Kensington Sterling, date October 18th. "Yes, ma'am, I have the file right in front of me." "I am officially exercising the owner's prior hold clause," I declared, the words hanging heavy and final in the air. "The property has a prior private use for that entire weekend." There was a fraction of a second of silence on the line. Then understood completely, ma'am. Refund their deposit in full, every single cent. Execute the transfer effective first thing Monday morning. Consider it done, says Mrs. Sterling. He did not ask why. He had worked for me for over 2 decades. He knew exactly what that specific quiet tone meant. He had heard that exact tone the day we successfully beat the city's demolition order in court. And he had heard it the day Arthur died. Thank you, Marcus, I said softly. Of course, Mrs. Sterling. He paused. For what it is worth, ma'am, I am incredibly glad you finally said it. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag. The brass plaque caught the fading afternoon light, glowing like a beacon. My name held perfectly steady on the wall. It had been there the entire time. They had simply been too blinded by their own arrogance to look up and see who owned the ground they walked on. So that was the singular phone call that ended the entire charade. The first call weeks ago had merely frozen the board. This call flipped the entire table over. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic threats, no expensive lawyers involved. It was simply an owner legally reclaiming her own property exactly the way her own ironclad contracts allowed. Here is exactly how the execution would play out. On Monday morning, precisely at 9 o'clock, Sterling Vanguard Hospitality would send the couple a highly polished, polite, devastatingly brief email. It would state that an unforeseen catastrophic scheduling conflict had arisen. A prior overriding hold on the property had been activated. The October 18th date was, most regrettably, no longer available under any circumstances. The full $10,000 deposit would be returned to their account within 3 standard business days. It would be clean, entirely legal, and terrifyingly. And it would be entirely, beautifully, agonizingly unexplained. I am intimately familiar with that specific email template because I personally wrote it 15 years ago for exactly these rare, extreme situations. I never in my wildest nightmares imagined I would be deploying it against my own son's wedding. The estate staff would not say a word more to Clara because the staff genuinely did not know anything more. To them it was a standard owner's hold, as routine as a landscaping upgrade. Only Marcus knew the truth, and Marcus has guarded my secrets with his life for 22 years. I walked out to my car and drove home. I did not call Julian, I did not text Clara, I did not send Victoria a gloating word. That was the entire point of the exercise. For months they had talked over me, talked around me, and talked about me as if I were deaf and dumb. They had collectively decided that I was not a part of the conversation, so I removed myself from the conversation entirely, taking the venue with me. Silence, I have learned, is the absolute loudest, most deafening weapon a quiet woman possesses. I executed the strike on a Saturday afternoon. They would not discover the fallout until Monday morning. In the space between, I had a lovely, quiet weekend planned. I intended to drink tea, tend to my late-blooming roses in the garden, and complete the Sunday crossword puzzle. I fully intended to enjoy every single second of the calm before the storm. I spent the entirety of Saturday on my knees in the dirt of the garden. The autumn asters were just starting to bloom. I cut several vibrant stems and arranged them in a simple vase for the kitchen table. On Sunday, I calmly did my laundry. When I pulled the linen napkins from the dryer, I meticulously folded every single one of them into a clean, flawlessly sharp square. 40 years of unbreakable habit. Clara had laughed cruelly at that habit. She had called me a maid. But there is a massive, fundamental difference between serving others because you are forced to, and tending to things carefully because you genuinely care about the details. Clara had never learned that vital distinction. I had built a $400 million empire on it. I stacked the folded napkins neatly in the drawer and put the kettle on. Across town, as I would later learn, Clara was having a spectacularly wonderful weekend. She had spent Saturday evening aggressively posting highly edited photographs of the Monarch estate to all of her social media accounts. She posted pictures of the sweeping stone facade, the glittering lake, and the massive ballroom with its flawlessly restored, hand-painted ceiling. My ceiling, our exclusive venue. She had captioned the photos, adding a barrage of sparkle emojis. Can you even believe we secured this place? Hundreds of her friends and acquaintances had liked the posts, leaving comments begging to know how on earth she had managed to book somewhere with a 2-year waiting list. She smugly replied to them, claiming it was all about having the right connections and impeccable taste. She was, at that exact moment, publicly bragging to half the state about a magnificent building she had already lost. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the ground had already vanished beneath her feet. She had one final peaceful evening remaining, so did I. The massive difference was that I knew exactly why my evening was peaceful. I poured my tea, sat by the large bay window and watched the sun slowly set over a town that had never, not once guessed exactly what I owned within it. Monday morning arrived. The automated email was dispatched exactly at 9 o'clock sharp. I know this for a fact because I had specifically instructed Marcus to silently blind copy my private email address on the correspondence. I read the notification while sipping my morning coffee. 2 brief, devastating paragraphs: a scheduling conflict, a prior hold invoked by the ownership. The October 18th date was officially revoked. Sincere regrets, full refund processing immediately. By 9:15, Clara was frantically calling the venue. The front desk receptionist was extremely polite, deeply apologetic, and offered absolutely no explanation. The booking office manager was similarly regretful and entirely unhelpful. The elite wedding planner was completely blindsided. She had been entirely cut out of the loop as well. By 10 o'clock, Clara had called the estate's main line 4 separate times, her voice escalating from confused to hysterical. Marcus took none of the calls personally. There was absolutely nothing to say that anyone was legally permitted to say. Could we please just move the booking to another available date? Clara had finally begged, dropping the arrogant facade. Of course, Kensington, the booking office cheerfully informed her. Our very next available Saturday opening is in exactly 26 months. 26 months, the lavish October wedding, the heavily distributed invitations, the custom designer dress, the imported cake, the 150 high society guests, all of it completely vaporized in a single crisp Monday morning. I took another slow sip of my coffee and let the chaos unfold without me. By noon, the frantic conspiracy theories had begun to fly. Clara initially decided it must be a catastrophic computer glitch. Then, grasping at straws, they theorized it was impending severe weather, or perhaps a sudden structural issue, or a massive insurance liability problem. By that evening, the panic had set in, and Clara and Victoria were viciously blaming each other for the failure. Then they aggressively blamed the venue's management. Then, remarkably, they shifted the blame to Julian's Aunt Margaret, accusing her of somehow sabotaging the booking out of spite. They systematically blamed every single person in the county. Everyone, of course, except the quiet, unassuming woman they had arrogantly seated next to the trash cans at table 12. Here is the part of the story that I truly deeply savor. Not a single one of those supposedly intelligent high society people thought to ask the most basic, fundamental question: who actually owns the building? They were so entirely consumed with aggressively deciding who counted as real family, and who was worthy of their presence, that they never once bothered to check whose name was printed on the legal deed. If you have ever been chronically underestimated by arrogant people, you know exactly how intoxicating this specific feeling is. The silence was deafening, and the impending dinner was going to be biblical. Julian called me late Monday night. His voice was incredibly tight, strung tighter than a piano wire. Mom, the venue completely fell through. The whole thing is gone. It is an absolute disaster. Oh, Julian, sweetheart, I said, my voice dripping with perfect maternal concern. I am so incredibly sorry to hear that. What on earth happened? Nobody knows. They absolutely refused to explain anything. They just sent a form email and wired the money back. Clara is a complete and total wreck. She won't stop crying. I let him talk. I made all the correct, soothing sounds. I am exceptionally good at making the right sounds. Is there anything at all I can do to help? I asked gently. Just pray for a miracle, I guess, a miracle. I almost smiled into the receiver. I had already supplied the exact opposite of a miracle. Then he said the part that genuinely troubled me. Clara thinks somebody did this to us on purpose. Mom, he said, his voice dropping. She thinks someone deliberately called the venue and sabotaged our booking. Why would anyone do that? That is exactly what I would ask, I replied smoothly. But she is absolutely convinced, and she thinks it was Aunt Margaret. Margaret! The one person who had texted me the truth, the one decent, honest voice in that entire toxic mess. I sat up perfectly straight at the kitchen table, my eyes narrowing. I had been perfectly willing to let this entire situation play out quietly. I would have been content to let them puzzle over a random scheduling conflict for the rest of their lives. But I would absolutely not sit idly by and watch them pin their destruction on Margaret. Julian, my tone shifting to something slightly firmer. Perhaps everyone should sit down together and talk this through. Calmly, as adults, Clara wants exactly that, he admitted. She wants a full family to interrogate everyone and find out exactly who did this. Then have it here, I said immediately. At my house, this Wednesday evening I will cook dinner. He sounded immensely relieved, really. You would do that for us, Mom. Of course, Julian, I said smoothly. We are family, aren't we? I hung up the phone and immediately began setting the table in my mind. 8 chairs, I knew exactly who would be sitting in every single one of them. And I knew exactly how the night would end. Wednesday arrived. I spent the entire afternoon cooking. I prepared a massive crown roast, scalloped potatoes, and the garlic green beans Julian had loved since he was a little boy. I cleaned the house until every surface practically shone. I did not do it to impress them, I did it for myself to prepare my battlefield. On the prominent wooden shelf in the dining room, right next to my favorite framed photograph of Arthur, I deliberately set down the heavy ring of brass master keys. I placed them right out in the open in plain sight. They were the master keys to every single locked door at the Monarch estate. I knew absolutely no one would notice them. Arrogant people never notice the quiet things that matter most. I had learned that lesson the hard way. Inside the heavy oak sideboard drawer, resting right beside the good silver flatware, I carefully laid 2 pieces of paper. The certified deed with my name printed on it, and the formal letter of gratitude from the Preservation Society. I did not write or practice a dramatic speech. Quiet people do not need grand speeches. We only need 1 or 2 absolutely true sentences delivered at the exact right moment. I set the large dining table for 8 people: Julian and Clara, Victoria and her remarkably silent husband, Margaret, 2 of Arthur's elderly cousins, and me. I placed my own setting at the absolute head of the table, in my own dining room, where absolutely no one could ever tell me to sit at the back. I folded every single linen napkin myself, creating sharp, clean, perfect architectural squares. It was an old habit, and it was about to become incredibly relevant. By 6 o'clock the roast was resting, the wine was breathing, and the table was flawlessly laid. I went upstairs and changed into a completely plain dark navy dress. I clasped Arthur's old gold wristwatch around my wrist, the only piece of jewelry I own that holds any actual meaning. The doorbell rang sharply at 6:30. I smoothed the front of my dress, took one long, incredibly slow breath to center my heart rate, and walked down the hall to let my loving family inside. The dinner began civilly enough. It almost always does in these situations. We politely passed the potatoes. Victoria, attempting to be gracious, complimented the china. "This is lovely Wedgwood, Evelyn," she noted, inspecting the rim of her plate. "Arthur's mother's," I replied simply. Margaret sat quietly at the far end of the table, her shoulders tight with anxiety, her eyes darting around the room. Then halfway through the main course, Clara abruptly set down her heavy silver fork. It clattered loudly against the china. "I think we need to stop pretending and talk about what actually happened," Clara announced, her voice tight and high-pitched. "While we are all sitting here together, of course, dear," I said mildly, leaning over to refill her water glass. "Someone maliciously sabotaged my wedding," Clara stated, her voice rising in volume and hysteria. "Somebody maliciously called that venue and got our date permanently cancelled. People do not just lose a $50,000 booking like that for no reason." "That is a very serious accusation to make, Clara," I said, my tone remaining perfectly pleasant. "It is a serious thing that happened to me," she snapped, glaring around the table. "Someone in this exact family did this to us on purpose." Victoria laid a manicured hand over her daughter's arm, her eyes gleaming with readiness for a fight. "Tell them exactly what you think happened, sweetheart. Don't hold back." Clara's venomous gaze snapped directly to Margaret. "You never wanted me to be part of this family," Clara hissed, pointing an accusatory finger. "You texted Evelyn behind my back, complaining about the seating chart. Do not sit there and think I don't know about it." Margaret went completely pale, her hands trembling as she dropped her napkin. "Clara, I never called anyone. I swear to you I would never do something so vindictive." "Then who the hell did?" Clara screamed, entirely dropping her polished facade. Julian finally spoke up, looking thoroughly miserable and exhausted. "Clara, please stop. Not here, not in my mother's house. No, Julian. I want answers, and I want them tonight," Clara demanded, slamming her hand on the table. The entire dining room plunged into a suffocating dead silence. Forks were set down, everyone was frozen, watching the meltdown. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, my hands neatly folded in my lap, and I said absolutely nothing. I let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. Then Clara whipped her head around and locked eyes with me. Her expression morphed instantly, adopting a terrifyingly fake, sickly sweet smile. "Evelyn," Clara said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You were the very last one of us to be at the venue on Saturday. You wandered off by yourself while we were touring the gardens, remember? I remember perfectly, I replied. So she smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. Did you happen to see anything suspicious? Did you talk to anyone? I looked at her for a very long, very heavy moment. I let her wallow in her own false superiority. As a matter of fact, Clara, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. I slowly, deliberately set down my silver spoon. It did not make a single sound against the china. But before I answer your specific question, I continued, holding her gaze, I would like you to answer one of mine. Clara blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. Fine, what is it? On Saturday, while we were at the venue standing in the executive planning office. What exact instructions did you give the wedding planner regarding where I should be seated? The atmosphere in the dining room fundamentally changed. You could physically feel it shift the exact way you feel the air pressure drop rapidly right before a violent thunderstorm hits. Clara's confident smile flickered and died. We were just casually organizing the preliminary tables, she stammered, suddenly looking everywhere but at me. You explicitly told her to put me at table 12, I stated, my voice devoid of anger, stating a simple fact, by the absolute back wall directly next to the restrooms and the kitchen doors. Evelyn, it was just a draft, Victoria started to intervene. And I continued, speaking right over Victoria, my voice remaining unnervingly even. You told her exactly why I needed to be placed there. Evelyn, please, Clara whispered, genuine fear finally entering her eyes. You said, and I quote, she is a peasant, she is not really part of this family, and I will not have her ruin my photos. I let those horrific words hang in the dead silent air of the dining room. Do you remember saying that, Clara? Dead silence. Julian had gone the color of ash. He stared at his plate, absolutely paralyzed. He knew. He had been standing right there in the hallway. He had heard every single word of her vitriol, and he had chosen cowardice. And now, in this horrifying moment, he finally understood that I had been standing there. Too, Mom, Julian choked out, his voice cracking. Mom, in a moment, Julian, I said, silencing him with a single look. Victoria desperately reached for her wineglass and took a massive gulp, her pearls clinking against the crystal. Clara's face was contorting, cycling rapidly through fear, calculation, and desperate defense. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Clara cried out, her voice breaking. You meant it exactly the way it sounded, Clara, I said, my tone still remarkably gentle. And honestly, that is perfectly all right. You are the bride, it is your wedding. I slowly folded my hands together and rested them on the white tablecloth. You possess the absolute right to seat your guests however you see fit. You have the right to exclude anyone you want. I pushed my chair back and slowly stood up from the head of the table. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. I walked with deliberate, measured steps over to the wooden shelf by Arthur's photograph. I reached out and picked up the heavy ring of brass keys. They were heavy. They have always been incredibly heavy. I walked back to the table and dropped the keys directly dead center, right between the ruined crown roast and the flickering silver candelabra. They hit the solid wood table with a massive, deafening metallic crash that made everyone physically jump. These specific keys, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room, open every single locked door at the Monarch estate. They have opened every door there for the last 38 years. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. I turned, walked over to the heavy oak sideboard, opened the drawer, and pulled out the two crisp pieces of paper. I walked back and slapped them down on the table right next to the keys. The certified deed, the formal letter, that spectacular building you strutted through was a condemned, rotting ruin in 1989, I said, my voice finally taking on the hard, sharp edge of cold steel. The city had voted to bulldoze it, my husband and I bought it for pennies, and I spent the next 4 decades of my life rebuilding it from the dirt up, room by grueling room. Clara stared at the brass keys as if they were a live venomous snake. What are you saying? She whispered, her voice trembling. I am saying that I own the Monarch estate, I stated clearly. My voice did not rise, it did not need to. The truth was loud enough to shatter the windows. I am the founder and sole owner of Sterling Vanguard. I own the entire company that runs that venue, and 20 others just like it across the country. There is a massive brass plaque in the grand foyer with my name engraved on it. You walked past it a dozen times on Saturday and never once bothered to look up. The remaining color completely drained from Victoria's face. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. I turned my gaze directly to Clara, pinning her to her chair. You were absolutely right about one thing, my dear, I said, delivering the final fatal blow. I am not really part of your family's little aesthetic. A devastating pause. I owned the ground you were standing on. Clara broke first. The tears came fast and violent, but they were the desperate, angry tears of someone who realizes they have just burned their own lottery ticket. How could you do this to me? Clara shrieked, instantly twisting the narrative to make herself the victim. On my wedding day, what kind of sick, twisted person cancels their own son's wedding? She violently spun toward Julian, grabbing his arm. Are you going to sit there and let her do this to us? Victoria shot up from her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. This is absolute extortion. Victoria yelled, you cannot just do this. This is illegal. I will sue you for breach of contract. I refunded every single cent of your $10,000 deposit, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming like a scythe. I took absolutely nothing from you. I simply legally reclaimed my own private property. I slowly sat back down in my chair at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. The heavy brass keys sitting in the center of the table had already screamed everything that needed to be heard. For a long, agonizing moment no one spoke. Clara's desperate, manipulative tears stopped working and just hung there, entirely ignored by the room. Then slowly Julian pushed his chair back. He stood up. Everyone, Julian said, his voice trembling but carrying a new, unfamiliar weight. Stop, just stop. He turned and looked at me. He genuinely, truly looked at me for the very first time in over 18 months. He didn't see the worn cardigan. He didn't see the grieving widow. He saw the titan who had carried him his entire life. Mom, Julian said, his voice completely breaking. I was standing right there in the hallway outside the office. I heard her say it. I heard her call you a peasant. I heard her say you weren't part of this family. And I stood there and I didn't say a damn word. The entire was suffocatingly quiet. Clara stared at him, horrified. I have been saying nothing my entire adult life, Julian confessed, the tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. Every single time someone made you smaller, every time someone looked down on you, I just let it happen. Because it was easier for me, because I was so incredibly ashamed of where we came from, and so desperate to fit into their world. It was the most brutally honest, painful thing my son had said to me in his entire life. I will not pretend that it did not move me to my very core. It broke my heart all over again, but I did not reach out to comfort him, not yet. Some wounds need to be exposed to the air before they can be cleaned. I know you hurt her, Julian, I said softly, the anger draining away, leaving only profound sadness. That is the part that truly broke me, not her toxic words. I held his tear-filled eyes. Your silence. He flinched violently as if I had struck him. He had absolutely no defense. And for once in her life, neither did Clara. I looked around the wreckage of my dining room table. I looked at Victoria, trembling with impotent rage, gripping her chair. I looked at Clara, her flawless makeup completely ruined by her own arrogance. I looked at Margaret, who was silently weeping with relief. And I looked at Arthur's empty place setting, the chair where the only man who truly saw me used to sit. The motel lady, I said softly into the silence, built the most magnificent room you ever planned to stand in. Nobody said another word. The dinner was over, the wedding was over, the illusion was completely shattered. The next morning Clara and Victoria drove out to the Monarch estate one final humiliating time. There were a few minor deposit items they needed to physically collect from the office, a box of sample wedding favors, some borrowed decorative centerpieces. Marcus met them at the grand entrance doors. He was as flawlessly professional and gracious as he had ever been. I, of course, was not there. I was at home tending to my roses. Marcus called me that evening to give me the final report. He told me he walked them through the grand foyer toward the executive office. And Clara, he said, suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She stopped squarely in front of the east wall. She stopped right in front of the heavy brass plaque she had strutted past a dozen times without a single glance. This time she looked up. This time she read the word, the Monarch estate, rescued from ruin and fully restored in 1989 through the unwavering vision, relentless grit and sole generosity of Evelyn Sterling. Marcus said she stood there for a full 2 minutes. She did not speak, she did not move. She just stared at the brass letters, reading them over and over again, as if hoping the metal would magically rearrange itself into someone else's name. Victoria walked up slowly and stood beside her daughter. She read the plaque too. Her shaking hand reached up to clutch her authentic pearls. The woman they had sneeringly called a peasant, the woman they had dismissed as a maid, the woman they had explicitly banished to the back by the trash cans because she was not really part of this. Her name was permanently engraved in solid brass, bolted to the foundation of the most exclusive, $50 million venue in the state. The real family always sits up front, Victoria murmured under her breath. Marcus heard her say it. He noted that she seemed to be saying it entirely to herself. The once arrogant words had completely curdled into something bitter and humiliating. Clara did not cry this time. There was no audience left that was worth performing for. She just stared up at my name, finally seeing it exactly the way none of them ever had. It had been bolted to that wall the entire time. They had simply been too arrogant to look up. The wedding obviously never happened. Clara furiously tried to find another luxury venue to accommodate her aesthetic. But late October was completely booked everywhere, and the magical illusion of her perfection had shattered beyond repair. Within 3 weeks of the dinner, Clara angrily gave the engagement ring back to Julian. I firmly believe that losing the estate broke something fundamental inside her that she lacked the emotional vocabulary to name. She had built her entire identity on superficial appearances and the validation of others. And the grandest, most important appearance of her entire life had been effortlessly, ruthlessly pulled out from under her by a quiet woman wearing a faded cardigan. She initially told her social media followers that the wedding was simply postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. Then, shortly after the ring was returned, she stopped posting about it entirely, retreating into a humiliated silence. I kept my word to the absolute letter. The $10,000 deposit was wired back into her account, every single cent, within the 3 promised business days. I never touched a dime of it. As I said from the beginning, this was never about the money. Margaret was completely cleared of all their vicious accusations the exact second those brass keys hit my dining room table. She called me the morning after the dinner, a chaotic mix of hysterical laughing and crying. "Evelyn," Margaret wheezed through the phone, "you are the most magnificent, utterly terrifying woman I have ever met in my life. We have met for a long leisurely lunch every single Tuesday since that day." Victoria, unsurprisingly, I have never heard from again. I do not expect to. People like Victoria only acknowledge power they can leech off of. Julian and I are navigating much slower, more difficult waters. He calls me now, he really calls me, not just the rushed, breathless updates about his life. We are seeing someone together, the two of us, on Thursday afternoons. A professional counselor with incredibly kind eyes who understands how to let the heavy silences breathe in the room. Our relationship is not magically fixed. 34 years of looking away from the truth, of carrying deep-seated shame, does not magically mend itself in a single month of therapy. But he drove over to the house last Sunday and stayed for over 4 hours. He didn't look at his phone once. He got down on his knees and helped me pull weeds in the garden. We didn't talk much. We didn't really need to. It is a fragile start, but in my long, complicated life, fragile starts are the only things I have ever truly needed to build an empire. Right before Julian left that Sunday evening, I sat him down at the small kitchen table. I poured him a cup of coffee. "Julian," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "I need to say exactly one thing to you, and then we never have to speak of it again." He nodded slowly, bracing himself. "My door is always open to you. It always will be. You are my only son and I love you more than life itself." "Mom, please let me finish, Julian," I said, keeping my voice gentle but absolutely firm. "I love you, but I will never ever again allow anyone to tell me that I do not belong. Not Clara, not Victoria, not you, and certainly not near the people that I love and sacrificed for." He was incredibly quiet for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the kitchen table, tracing the wood grain. "You never should have had to, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I am so incredibly sorry." "I know you are," I replied softly. I stood up and walked him to the front door. Resting on the small side table by the entryway, I had deliberately left a single heavy linen napkin. I had folded it flawlessly into a clean, razor-sharp architectural square. I picked it up and pressed it gently but firmly into his hands. "I will always have a seat saved for you at my table, Julian," I told him, offering a small, true smile. "I just refuse to ever sit at the back of my own life again." He gripped that perfectly folded napkin like it was the most fragile, valuable thing in the world. And then he hugged me. He really hugged me, burying his face in my shoulder. It was the first genuine embrace we had shared in over 18 months. I have learned a profound lesson at 58 years old. The people who are actually worth keeping in your life are the ones who will proudly seat you at the very front of the room, long before they ever discover that you hold the master keys to the building. That is my story. It all hinged on one overheard venomous sentence, one 30-second, quiet phone call, and one name engraved on a brass wall that they were simply too arrogant to read. If anyone has ever looked down on you, if anyone has ever told you that you were a peasant, or that you were not really part of something important, let this be your definitive sign. Do not scream, do not cry, simply smile, walk away and take the ground right out from under them. Drop a comment below and tell me your story, hit that subscribe button and I will see you all next time. Remember, the quietest women build the loudest empires. Stay strong, stay silent until the moment is right, and never let them put you in the back.